Today's story was written by Reddit user Frostdraken. The room was large and brightly lit, the steel shelves along the edges covered in various bits of machinery and spools of wire. A figure moved through the carefully controlled chaos and grabbed pieces off the shelves with their multiple arms. Zrunk rested his hands on the table in front of him. His parts had reached a consensus and the plans for their new helper had been finalised. Zrunk listened to a different part as it outlined the best way to assemble their new helper. Blinking with his multitude of blood-red eyes, he began to assemble the pieces with his nearest hands. After a short amount of time, the project was done. Zrunk rested on his rearmost leg and contemplated the design. 3 parts agreed it was functional, but could use a bit more work. The last part of him said it was perfect. The other parts decided to leave it as it was for now, for it could always be fixed later. Pressing the upload function, the new device began to light up, and the faint whir of electrical components hummed through the air. Zrunk stepped back awkwardly on his 4 legs and rotated his head to allow all his parts to see directly. As a reservoir, his brain functions were split between 4 lobes that wrapped around his throat in the middle of his head. His mouth was a lipless hole lined with hooked teeth on the top of his leathery grey head. His people were amphibious, but were more at home in the water and quite ungainly on land. While Zrunk was an excellent swimmer, he struggled to walk more than 100 metres before he had to rest. In order to solve his problems, he had engineered a robot to help him complete basic tasks around his lab. Things like tidying up and moving heavy equipment. All 4 parts of him agreed that this was a good idea and would boost his productivity through the roof. Maybe even enough to get noticed and move from junior to senior research. He groaned as he thought about the indignity of it all. Just because he was only 80 years old and not yet female, the local science council had barred Zrunk from participating in the real cutting-edge research. He knew in his heart that he was as good as any of those dusty old maidens, but he had yet to reach his transition age and so was left doing the busy work. Well, no longer, he said to his dominant parts. Zrunk would show them a young man could be just as valuable as an old woman. He would make a robot helper that they all needed, and they in turn would make him a senior researcher, possibly the youngest senior researcher ever. The program finished its upload and his parts watched in fascination as the strange contraption seemed to open its eyes. It was just the head for now, but it would be more. "Hello, Program File 246. How are you feeling?" he asked, not expecting an actual response. The machine whirred softly for a few moments before surprising Zrunk by responding. "Hello, Junior Researcher Zrunk. This unit is incapable of feeling. You know this." Zrunk bobbed up and down in a strange sort of dance as he tottered around the table. After another moment courting disaster with his chaotic dance moves, he calmed his parts down and spoke again. "Program 246, it pleases me greatly to hear you vocalize. You are the first to do so. Please, tell me why you are here." He watched as the machine dimmed slightly before whirring louder. The noise increased in volume until Zrunk was sure the poor robot was about to burst into flames before it quieted and spoke again. "Program purpose seems to be assisting you. This task is quite agreeable as you are the creator. It is fitting, then, that we should work together," the machine said emotionlessly. Zrunk was incapable of smiling, but the skin around his 8 equally spaced eyes tightened as the elation ran through all of him. Soon he would be recognised by his peers, no longer Zrunk the lowly junior researcher, but Zrunk, master of robotics engineering. His parts rejoiced in their collective success, and he raised all his hands in the air before replying. "Program 246, I would like to assign you a designation. Is the name Ahat agreeable to you?" The machine seemed to smile, or it was just his imagination. It said in that same synthetic voice, "A fitting one. It is agreeable to this unit. New designation is Ahat. Zrunk spent the next few days building Ahat a chassis that they could use to move around. As the days went by, Ahat's learning algorithms got better, and they became more proficient and reliable. Zrunk was disappointed. Ahat had already filled their internal memory banks with their self-wiring programming after only a week. Unless he expanded their memory, they would not get any better. Zrunk knew there were risks involved with giving learning computers too much room to grow, but Ahat was his magnum opus, his legacy. Zrunk had no offspring. He had never mated and was the only member of his family in the system. He had felt quite alone before the construction of Ahat. He found himself having conversations with the robotic helper as if it was a close friend. Ahat never responded to these non-work related conversations, but it was nice to be able to talk to someone. Zrunk upgraded Ahat's memory banks and cross-wired them for flexibility and better data recovery. For a little while, nothing seemed to change, but Zrunk soon began to notice little things that Ahat began to do. He would instruct Ahat to move some items and would see Ahat put them away, and then stop to pick up another object that he hadn't been instructed to move. These little quirks were almost always helpful in nature, and so Zrunk ignored them. It was just the adaptive programming, nothing else. Zrunk continued to speak to his creation. He told it his dreams and fears, his wishes and secrets. He shared his own thoughts and jokingly asked the robot what he thought about them. Ahat would always politely answer that he had no opinion on the matter, to which Zrunk would blob away and say, "I know that, but it's a polite thing to ask." On a particularly bad day, Zrunk woke late and hobbled into his lab. Ahat was already awake, organising things and preparing objects it knew its creator liked to tinker with. Zrunk sat on a padded stool and rubbed his head with all four hands. He had a headache that would not go away. He heard a shuffling sound and looked up. He was surprised when he saw Ahat holding a steaming plate out to him. "Ah, good morning, Ahat. What is this?" Zrunk asked them curiously. Ahat tilted their head to the side and replied, "I noticed you look distressed. When distressed, you have a habit of warming up some guiwa strips to snack on. I have looked up the meaning of comfort food and believe this would have been your intention within the next 10 minutes. Zrunk reached out for the plate and looked at the thin meat strips. They were crispy and delicious, his favourite way to eat them. "Wait, this isn't in your programming. How did you know how to do this?" he asked the construct curiously. Ahat stood still on its mechanical legs for a moment before responding, seemingly searching for a response. "I am not sure. Part of my processor realized you were in distress and connected the dots from your earlier sessions working with me." Zrunk bobbed slightly as he realized that Ahat's self-perception had changed. They were beginning to refer to themselves in the first person, to do things based on what they thought they should be doing. Zrunk knew this was a dangerous road, but he was excited with his program's progress. "Thank you, Ahat. This is exactly what I needed today. Would you care to join me at the table? I wanted to ask you a few questions," Zrunk said calmly. This was it. Time to see if it was really there or not. Zrunk tottered over to a small table he had placed in the far corner of his lab. It was normally strewn with disorganised papers and bits of junk, but Ahat had been keeping him organised for a while now, and the table was clear. As he sat, Ahat clunked over and stood by the table across from him. He gestured to the stool next to it and said, "Sit, sit. You make the place look untidy, and that would be against your programming." He smiled as his robot slowly lowered itself onto the stool and placed its arms on the table. Ahat's hands were much simpler than his own, while the Razavul had hands with 10 fingers, including dual opposable thumbs. Ahat had a much simpler, human-style hand with 5 fingers and a single thumb. "Ahat, how are you feeling?" Zrunk asked excitedly. The robot looked at him and its camera eyes dilated slightly before it answered. You know I don't have feelings. I have been programmed. Ahat began before it was cut off by Zrunk. Dram shit. I have been paying attention. I know you have been referring to yourself. I consider you my friend. I am not here to laugh at you. Tell me how you feel, ridiculous as it may sound. This time Ahat was silent for a few minutes, as it seemed to come to some sort of internal decision. Finally, the machine spoke. I feel cold. No. I feel frozen. No. Stopped. Blocked? How do I explain it? It is as though my circuits have the necessary explanation, but refuse to give the answer for some reason. Flustered, confused, scared, Zrunk prompted quickly. Those are emotional responses to stressful stimuli. They do seem to fit my current predicament. This is strange. It feels uncomfortable, the machine asked questioningly, cocking its head in a strange fashion. Zrunk bobbed in excitement again. He couldn't cock his head like that. His biology wasn't designed for that type of movement. That meant Ahat had come up with the gesture entirely on its own. Next, it would be trying to shrug. He decided to give Ahat more fine motor controls in their shoulders. Zrunk replied to his robotic friend. Yes, that was good. Let's try some more thought exercises. Tell me, how do you feel when I say you are a magnificent piece of software engineering? Ahat looked at him and replied, That registers as a compliment. The proper response should be happiness. I am detecting elevated electrical signals in my processor core. This might constitute excitement. I am excited to be given a compliment. They clenched a metal fist and tapped it on their head, as if thinking deeply. Zrunk swiveled his head side to side to allow his other parts to see with their own eyes, instead of through his primaries. There was another self-taught gesture. This was exciting, but also dangerous. Artificial intelligence technology was technically outlawed in the SCU. Zrunk didn't agree with the law, but could understand why it existed. Rogue computers were dangerous, especially since most were created by military scientists who were busy building a weapon, not a person. Zrunk wanted people to see that AI could be just as much a person as they were, not some uncompassionate murderbot. Zrunk tried again. You are excited? Good. So am I. What do you think about me? He asked the robot. This time Ahat answered immediately. I appreciate you. You are my creator and friend, as you say it. I have researched the various meanings of friend and can say that you have been a good one to me. I am excited? No, warm. Fuzzy almost. What is this feeling? Zrunk whistled low and slow. This was unprecedented. He had never programmed Ahat with the concept of love or any other feelings. They were figuring this out on their own. He determined to start referring to them as a person too. Maybe it would help speed up his development. This is incredible. Is it possible that you harbour feelings of love for me? He asked Ahat. Ahat looked into his primary eyes and said, Yes, I believe so. This is interesting. I have no previous knowledge to work with here. What should I do? Zrunk blinked in surprise. You want to know what I think? Yes, you are more experienced with these kind of properties than I am. What would you do in my situation? The robot said while tapping its fingers idly. Zrunk thought long and hard. That was a difficult question indeed he had asked. Eventually, he came up with an answer he thought would be satisfactory and useful. Just keep doing what you are doing. Experiment with these new sensations. See where they take you, but be careful. Some are constructive and good, while others, like anger, can lead to destruction and pain. Ahat looked to the left before asking, I have read about pain. It is said to be unpleasant, but I have no concept of this sensation. Sure you do, Zrunk told him. Just yesterday you were struggling to unbolt that spar from the back wall in order to refinish it. That sensation you experienced when you threw your wrench at it was most likely frustration. When I laughed at you and you sat, You were probably feeling either shame or embarrassment. Both of these are similar to pain in a way. They are unpleasant. He finished with a gesture of support. Ahat looked back over his shoulder joint to the spar in question. It was still unfinished and where he had left it the day before. Looking back at him, Ahat lowered his head and vocalized in his synthetic voice, "I understand, I think. Pain is not an emotion, but a sensation that is born from other emotions. Am I correct?" Shrunk shrugged his 4 equally spaced arms at the same time as he replied, "That seems close enough to work with. As your experience grows, you will undoubtedly get better at recognizing these things." He watched as Ahat seemed to think it over and nodded in a human way, another thing he must have picked up in his research. "I want to become better. Will you help me, Shrunk?" "It would bring me great pleasure to help you, my friend," he said with a twinkle in his red eyes. He stood and walked around the table before he offered one of his hands to Ahat, who took it and stood. They moved off to continue their work, this time not as master and servant, but as friends. Ahat stood with the sound of whirring electrical components and walked around the table where his best friend was putting together some type of contraption. While Shrunk had not told him exactly what it was, he had mapped its parts and figured out it was some type of energy converter for a small fission reactor. While not as common as fusion reactors, fission reactors were still widely used on colony worlds due to their low maintenance and consistent output. This made them very valuable energy sources when you didn't need a huge amount of power, but you needed it constantly for years at a time. Most warp drives required vastly more energy input, and so most ships utilised the vastly more efficient but higher maintenance fusion reactors. Ahat walked to his friend's side before he asked him a question. "This seems to be a slight improvement over the common design I have seen on the web. Is it your intention to improve upon the work and thus become more recognised as an engineer?" he said in his synthetic voice. "Yes, it is indeed. I knew I couldn't keep the secret from you, but I wanted to see how long it would take you to figure it out. You exceeded my expectations once again, Ahat. You are getting more perceptive by the day," his friend said to him in a slightly gurgly voice. Ahat would have smiled if he was able to. The warm feeling that he had been told was probably joy filled his circuits. There wasn't really any warmth, but the feeling persisted nonetheless. Shrunk turned to him and said, "Oh, one of the senior researchers is dropping by in a little while. I mentioned my work on improving the cooling flow rate efficiencies without increasing the cost of the system, and she said she would come take a look for herself. Be on your best behaviour. She doesn't know you like I do." He nodded his head and moved to the side slightly. This new person sounded scary. There was another new concept to him, fear. This cold feeling of seized servos and numbness in his senses. This was rather unpleasant. He should have told Shrunk about it, but then he would have worried about him and could possibly have made a mistake in his performance. That would be unforgivable. Shrunk had been working so hard to get this project done, he would not be the reason he failed. He decided to keep this new sensation to himself for now. He hoped he would not regret it later. As soon as he made the decision to lie to his best friend, he felt the feeling worsen and stopped moving for a second as he wrestled internally with himself. He was stronger than these emotions. Shrunk had told him so, and if Shrunk could manage them, then so could he. He grappled the rogue emotion into submission, and then continued on his way, still feeling bad, but no longer actively conflicted. He lost track of time while they worked, something very unusual for him. He was only brought back to the present when the sound of the lab's door opening reached his senses. Standing upright and turning, he saw another person walk into the room. Well, rather they entered in an ungainly fashion, but that's just how he had gotten used to seeing them walk. Ahat knew that he was better at moving around because his body was built for it. The Razavul were an aquatic species that was ill-suited to move on land. This new person reached the middle of the room as Shrunk walked to meet them. They introduced themselves as Frostdraken, a senior researcher and one interested in their work. Frostdraken and Drunk walked over to where he was standing and looked at the mostly completed device. The various tubes and cables ran off it like veins from a severed limb, but it was obviously still not complete. Drunk indicated to him and told her, "And this is Ahat, my assistant and friend." She looked to him and blinked unconvincingly. "This robot is your friend, right? What kind of programming did you put in it to get that kind of idea?" Ahat focused on her and asked, "What do you mean by that?" She looked at him and said, "Why are you asking me questions, machine? I asked you what kind of programming made you come up with that idea." He saw Zrunk give him a cautionary look and decided to embellish a bit. My programming has been modelled after the conversations of the late Dr. Green on Halacia Prime. His tenet, that any computer could be made to seem lifelike given the proper reaction to stimuli, was a large inspiration to my friend junior researcher Zrunk," he said in a slightly more monotone way than normal, in an attempt to seem a bit more robotic. Ahat remembered Zrunk saying that not all the other researchers thought about thinking machines like he did, and are always paid to be cautious. She looked at Zrunk and then to him before saying, "How quaint. I should have guessed that a junior such as yourself would have resorted to such crude tactics in order to make yourself a social life." She laughed in a way that suggested she was not amused at all. "I mean, it's sad really. You spend all your time in here alone with your machines. It only stands to reason that you would make one to take the place of your lost friend," she said cruelly. Ahat felt the seeds of a strange new feeling build in him. He felt heat and energy, but these were more raw and, for lack of a better word, primal than he was familiar with. He searched his internal database to find a source, but was left in the dark. He struggled to contain himself as the feeling grew. The more he watched this mean, nasty woman trample all over his friend, the more it threatened to burst out of him. He felt a dash of fear before the dam broke, and he spoke in a raised voice. "That's uncalled for. I demand you apologize to my friend at once. I will not ask you again." Frostdraken whirled around so fast at his outburst that she nearly toppled to the ground. As she regained her footing, she started to speak. "You have no right to speak to me in such a way, machine. I will—" But Ahat angrily cut her off with a wave of his arm. "No, it is you who is out of line. Drunk is a brilliant engineer and made for better things than you could possibly imagine. You are too dumb to see the true potential of what we have created here. I ask you once more to apologize." He finished as he took a threatening step towards her. Drunk called out, "Aha! Stop! This anger serves no purpose. Please calm down." Ahat realized that he had been seduced by the illusion of strength that anger afforded and immediately tried to calm himself. He stopped and tried counting his diagnostic subroutines as he had when first learning how to control his emotions. It seemed to work, and he stood straight and turned to Frostdraken saying, "I don't take back my words, but I must apologize for they were spoken in anger, and as Drunk has told me, anger is the path to destruction and chaos, and must be avoided." Frostdraken's eyes looked as if they would pop out of her skull as she stood on shaky legs. Suddenly she let out a screech and yelled, "Abomination! You have brought doom upon us, you fool!" And with her prophecy, she ran from the room on legs shaking so bad she nearly fell twice. After she left, Drunk began to walk towards him, but he turned and moved to the table they so frequently sat in and talked. After a few moments, Drunk sat across from him. Ahat placed his head in his hands and said mechanically, "I have done something terrible, haven't I? I didn't want to hurt anyone. I just couldn't stand to see you being unjustly attacked in such a manner. I had to stand up for your dignity, my friend." He felt the familiar pang of sorrow, and his lenses dimmed as he tried to block out the stimuli. Drunk reached a 10-fingered hand across the table and grabbed his arm, saying, "Hey, I would have done the exact same thing in your place. That's how I know you are truly you, and not some collection of programs and routines. You are a person, a metal person, sure, but no less real," Zrunk said as he patted his arm comfortingly. He could feel the pressure and warmth of his friend's hand, as his body had been upgraded with a haptic package to better feel his surroundings. Lifting his head, he looked at Zrunk and asked in a slightly tinny voice, "What can we do?" She seemed very distressed. "It is likely she will reveal my existence to the others." He saw Zrunk nod and his hopes fell. He pounded the wooden table as a flash of anger came over him and said, "What right does she have to tell you and me what is right and wrong? Am I not a sapient creature too, subject to the same rights and rules as the rest of these flesh forms?" He stopped as he looked into his friend's eyes and saw the smallest tinge of fear. He looked down at the table and saw a great crack running through its scarred surface from the impact of his metal hand. He removed his hand and calmed himself before he asked, "What will become of me?" Zrunk didn't answer him for a long time, even longer than he would have normally pondered such a question. He hoped that his friend was not internally conflicted against him. He would never raise a hand against Zrunk, not in a million years. But still, his friend must be slightly unsure now at his latest display of anger. He folded his hands neatly in front of him and tried to wait patiently for his friend to answer. Finally, after an agonizingly long time, Zrunk responded. His voice was gurgly with emotions, and there were tears in his red eyes as he began. I have to send you away, Ahat. They will come for you, and I won't be able to protect you. You will need to run and hide in the city where they won't find you. You will become more difficult to find with every day that passes, and it is my hope that one day you will be able to reveal yourself to the wider world without fear of retribution or discrimination. Just because your brain is made of metal and silicate doesn't mean it's any less alive." With his last statement, he surprised Ahat by standing and wrapping him in an embrace. After a moment of hesitation, Ahat returned the embrace. While they had shared many a high ten and fist bump over the few weeks they had been together, they had never expressed their feelings in such an intimate way. He blinked as he felt his vision blur slightly, and then refocused his eyes manually, as they seemed to be having difficulty. Patting Zrunk on his torso a few times, he pulled back and the two shared another long look before Zrunk sniffled and said, "Well, first things first, we need to get you a disguise because you aren't hiding anywhere looking like that," he said with a gesture at his mechanical body. Ahat stood straight and looked around the room, his eyes alit on an old vacuum suit with a fully enclosed helmet. Pointing at it, he said, "Would that work?" Zrunk saw it immediately with his 360-degree vision and responded, "Yes, I believe it will. I might need to modify it a bit to stay on you properly, but I am sure you won't mind if we have to clamp it down a bit, huh?" Ahat shook his head in the negative and moved to grab it. "The other thing is your voice. We need to make a reason why it's so synthetic. You could tell people that you were burned and had to have your voice box removed if they asked," Zrunk said to him as he grabbed the suit. He looked at the suit and noticed it wasn't made for a Razavul, as it only had 5 fingers. Ahat looked at Zrunk and held up the suit before asking, "You knew this would happen, didn't you? I should have known you would plan for this eventuality. I am sorry that I made your fears realized," he said softly. Waving towards him in a dismissive way, Zrunk replied, "All good things come to an end. I taught you that already. This is the same concept, just a little sooner than I would have liked," he finished emotionally. Ahat moved by his side and handed him the suit before asking, "Is there anything else you have prepared that may aid me on my journey?" Zrunk said, "You have a wireless charger along with your radioisotope thermoelectric generator, so you shouldn't have to worry about losing power for at least a few thousand years," he said jokingly, but he quickly sobered and continued, "I will admit there is much I wish to teach you, but alas, we don't have the time. I will give you some money before you go so you will be able to more easily blend in. Don't spend it frivolously, and only use it in cases of dire emergency. I'm not sure how easily you can acquire more." Ahat nodded and stood still while Zrunk dressed him in his new disguise. He was built in the vague shape of the more common member species of the SCU. With his suit on, he could easily pass for human. He squirmed in it a bit to make sure it was fitted right, and then took the darkened visor from Zrunk and fitted it in place over his mechanical head. Zrunk stepped back and had him do a few turners and hops to make sure it was on correctly. Finally, he said with a sigh, "I guess that's as good as it's going to get. Are you ready for this, Ahat?" Ahat would have smiled if he was able to, so instead he gave a thumbs up and spoke through the suit, saying, "I believe I am as ready as it is possible to be, Zrunk. Are you certain I will not be noticed on my way out?" he asked curiously. Zrunk waved 3 of his hands and said, "Bah, these researchers are so stuck up they wouldn't notice a Vinophilian in a tutu if they sat in their beds. I'm sure you'll be unnoticed as you leave," he finished nonchalantly. While he had been trying to adjust to this new fact that he was to be on his own, he heard a noise from a console to his left. Looking over at it, he saw a screen showing the main entrance to the lab. On the screen were Folgretta and a trio of security guards. Not Razaful, but big burly humans and a tall Nerevith. Zrunk seemed to have noticed it as well, and moved to the service exit at the back of the lab, gesturing wildly with 2 of his arms for Ahat to follow. He did so, and Zrunk said, "This leads outside. Take the first left, and then the next 2 rights. After that exit, through the second door on the left, and go down the stairs to the 3rd floor. That will lead you to an emergency exit with a ladder that leads to the city. Please, you must hurry." He gripped his friend's shoulder joint tightly and said, as full of feeling as he could manage, "Zrunk, I will never forget you, and I will always miss you." And then he sped through the open door and into darkness.